Okay, so welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester and host of the webinar series that's part of the Forest Connect program. And we're joined each month by fabulous speakers. This month is no exception. Steve Gabriel is the Extension Agroforestry Specialist based on the Ithaca campus, and like I, works through the Cornell University Cooperative Extension System. Steve's home base is with the Cornell Small Farms Program. Steve's been doing all things mushrooms for many years, and has a great presentation this evening, The Economics of Log-Grown Shiitake. And he's going to be talking about it from implications with forest management and some research that's happened in the Northeast. So, Steve, I'm going to let you turn your microphone back on, and then I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Peter. All right, so take two here. Thanks for coming out, folks, to the webinar here, and I look forward to sharing this sort of newer material with you. I've been teaching a lot in the past many years about how to grow mushrooms, and we're getting a little more mature in the sense that in addition to that, we can offer more in terms of what we're seeing as some of the wider implications of shiitakes, and I'm particularly excited about some of the recent developments, which I hope will lead to more people thinking about this as a really viable crop. So I'm going to walk through this presentation and talk through some of those different aspects, and feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go, and we can also wrap up with any questions towards the end. Just a little bit about my background. So I've been at Cornell about 7 years, and I've done a lot of different things in the horticulture department. I partnered with Ken Mudge, who's a recently retired professor of horticulture, who took a liking to mushrooms several years ago and did about a decade's worth of research, which really paved the way for us to take this to the next step, which is to look at the practicality of growers adopting this. We're interested in hobby growers as well as commercial, but certainly our commercial growers have been our focus because we really want to find ways that people can make a livelihood and take care of their land at the same time. I also have a farm I co-own with my wife, Elizabeth, just west of Ithaca, and it's a small 10-acre piece of property, and we do a lot on it. We do grow mushrooms, and I sort of, as I learned and started teaching, I thought this might be something we want to do, and we end up being part of the small but growing network of mushroom farmers, and we've taken that on in our woods, and we also do maple syrup. We raise pastured lamb, we raise duck eggs, and we do a number of educational programs. And some crops coming down the line are things like elderberry syrup and pawpaws eventually. Well, that'll be a few years off now. So it's kind of some background on me. Ken Mudge and I also co-authored a book called Farming the Woods that came out last fall, and really mushrooms is one part of several different crops known as non-timber forest products that can complement timber management, firewood harvesting, and other uses. So we really wanted to present a wide range of what's possible in a woodlot. So that book, again, is Farming the Woods. So I'm going to focus on mushrooms, and the talk as advertised was really called log-grown mushrooms, but we're going to really zoom in on the shiitake mushroom, and I'll explain why as we go through this. And this mushroom is, out of the 4 species that we promote for cultivation in a woodland setting, those 4 species being shiitake, oyster, lion's mane, and scropharia, or the wine cap mushroom. Shiitake is the lone non-native species. This is a mushroom who has been cultivated for 900 years in Asia, mostly in Japan, Korea, and parts of China. So it has a long history of cultivation, one of our older agricultural products, and so humans have been playing with this for a long time and figuring out the kinks, so we have that advantage. The other mushrooms, which I'll mention our website, cornellmushrooms.org, the other mushrooms are great and a good addition to these, but especially from a crop standpoint, a commercial standpoint, shiitake is really the one that for various reasons, is one that farmers could reliably produce throughout the growing season. The other ones sort of come and go as the weather conditions permit. So we focus on shiitake a lot because of that potential for consistent and profitable production. It's considered a weak competitor, so if we're inoculating fresh wood with shiitake, it tends to colonize well and fruit well, and the logs will last in production for several seasons. But it's not something we've seen sort of escape into the natural environment, and it is part of a whole family of decomposing fungi. So you may be familiar with mycorrhizal fungi, mushrooms that form symbiotic relationships with plants. Well, mostly what we can cultivate easily, especially outdoors, are these saprophytic or decomposing fungi, and these are ones that colonize dying or dead organic matter. So I'm not too concerned about shiitake's escaping, so to speak, anytime soon, and there's plenty of other things out there decomposing other wood. So they're happy to live in logs, and we don't find them migrating too far from the tree, so to speak. What we're looking at when we look at shiitake production are essentially what you see on the slide here. Small diameter polewood, generally from 3 inches in diameter to 8 inches in diameter, and generally about 3 feet long, although you can really cut it to any length to suit your purpose. Most growers just find that 3 feet is manageable. We can carry them around easily. You can move them and stack them and things like that. Any shorter, storage and stacking becomes more difficult. Any longer, and it becomes a little hard on the back to move your logs around. And we're harvesting fresh cut logs. We're not inoculating trees that have been down for months or years. We're really focused on fresh wood, and that is because we need to get our mushrooms introduced to this wood before another competitive fungi takes over. So if a tree is down in the woods for even a couple months, chances are some other fungus has colonized it, which is perfectly fine for soil health and forest health, but not so much for production. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of our material. And inoculation is not something we're going to dig too deep in this presentation. When I refer you to our website, I'll talk about some of the resources we have. We have a lot to offer in terms of basic cultivation. We also offer an online course through our Beginning Farmer project, which I'll talk a bit about, and we do some hands-on and in-person trainings as well as we get into the spring months. So I'll share that information. But just to give you a sense, with inoculation, there's basically 3 steps. The first is that we drill holes, about 50 holes in each log. Those holes are then filled with the mycelium, and that is usually in 2 forms, one of 2 forms. It's either inoculated wooden dowels that you can just pound into those holes, or it's sawdust that's mixed with the mushroom mycelium that is plunged into the holes and kind of fills up the space. And once you've filled those holes, which is step 2, then step 3 is to cover those holes with wax, which kind of closes the log back up, helps keep moisture in, helps keep contamination out. So that's kind of the basics of cultivation. And there's a lot of other ways to introduce mycelium to mushrooms, but this is kind of the basic for shiitake. It's very proven, very successful in terms of production. And the real reason that shiitake shines amongst some of the other species that we've worked with in cultivation is because it has this sort of novel effect where you can do that inoculation process, and then you actually set your logs aside for a good year. And during that year, the mycelium, which is this white thread-like material, and that is what colonizes the wood, needs to grow through the entirety of that log. And especially in colder climates, half that year time that you're waiting is a dormant season, so there's very little to no growth going on at that point. So if we inoculate logs in May of 2015, they'll be ready to fruit in the following May, 2016. Once they're ready to fruit, what's remarkable and why these work so well commercially is because you can soak the logs in a tank of water or a pond or a stream or really anything you can submerge them in for 24 hours, and that encourages a force, a flush of mushrooms coming out of the log. You can leave them be and never move them or soak them, and they will fruit mushrooms here and there. Those yields tend to be more sporadic in nature and tend to not be as high in terms of the yield. So you might see 2 or 3 mushrooms popping out after a large rainstorm. With the soaking method, you get pretty reliable yields, 1/4 to 1/2 pound per log per soak. and those tend to show up about 7 to 10 days after you pull those logs out of the tank. And so this allows farmers and growers who want to get into commercial markets an opportunity to time their soaking with their market. So if I have farmers market on a Thursday, the previous week on Wednesday or Thursday, I'll stick my logs in the tank and pull them out, and they should be good to go by the time I'm ready to go to market. So for instance, at our farm, we have about 1,000 logs, and starting around June 1st, we start soaking every week. We soak about 150 or so of those logs. When a log has been soaked and fruited, it needs time to rest. So that's why we don't soak all 1,000 at once. We soak 150 a week and kind of work through the logs. And by the time we get back to that first group, they've rested sufficiently and we can soak them again. And in central New York, we tend to be able to do this from June 1st to October 1st. If you go further south, you have a little bit longer season. And if you go further north, you tend to have a bit shorter season, although it always depends. So this fall, I'm still. Last week was probably, although I won't count my eggs until they've hatched. It's probably the last time I'll do a delivery. We still had some mushrooms fruiting due to the warm weather. So mushrooms like it, like a lot of us, when the temperatures are above 55 degrees, stay in 90. So anything below that, and they're either slowed down or they will go dormant. And so that's sort of the gist of cultivation. We have a lot of great resources to get into some of the nitty-gritty, because of course there's lots of detail. This guide on the left is a 35-page document that was a combination of extension work, research, and grower input. It really marches you through all the pieces of the process. It's a free download on our website. And it's nicely accompanied with a number of videos featuring Dr. Mudge talking about the different stages of cultivation. And so the combination of those two things can really get a lot of people started in cultivation, although it's always great to visit the grower, find a workshop, kind of do it hands-on to really get a sense of it. And again, those can be found at the link that Peter put in the chat box, cornellmushrooms.org. So we're going to focus a lot on sort of the economics and industry development and talk about some of the implications of that for general forest management in this evening's talk. And so we did a survey just this past year just to get a sense of in New York, and I'll mention that a lot of the data I have is related to New York, and I know some of you are tuning in from other states. And of course, the regulatory and sort of policy climate of different states varies. So we've been working specifically in New York and generally in the Northeast. So while cultivation is pretty much the same wherever you are in the Northeast, even down into the Southeast and the Midwestern U.S., when we look at individual states, what we find is there's a lot of nuances that affect how people are growing. So right now in New York, we have 46 growers basically that have plans for commercial production or are currently producing mushrooms for sale. And those growers are cultivating a total of 17,435 logs, which is yielding, as sort of a theoretical, over 3 years, because these logs don't fruit and aren't spent in one season. They last for generally 3 seasons. So over those 3 seasons, those logs should produce close to 70,000 pounds of mushrooms, which sold at our kind of average price of $12 a pound is getting us well over $800,000 of gross income. So that's sort of the potential of the logs that are out there in the woods of New York State going. It's pretty good, and I'm eager to see us increase that mark. We'll have a little mushroom party when we get over $1 million in gross sales. But in actuality, what we see is about half of those growers are really in the game. And a lot of this is because, again, because of that year-long waiting period, a lot of folks have inoculated logs this year and are waiting for 2016 to fruit them. So about half of those growers actually sold mushrooms, and the income this year was around $180,000, and that breaks down to $7,800 or so per grower. So not too bad. Some growers just getting started, some doing well over 10 or even 15,000 or 20,000 in sales. So there's quite a wide range. This is very much a fledgling young industry. But we do see that most growers are planning to expand their production and continue to grow. Most growers seem to top out somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 logs, although we're starting to see folks thinking about much higher amounts than that. We have a comparative survey. This is a survey done by Chatham University in 2014. It was for the whole Northeast, so it gives you some sense, but it's interesting because their numbers for the Northeast are almost similar to our numbers for New York alone. And I know, particularly in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, there's quite a bit of cultivation going on. So suffice to say, in the Northeast, we don't fully have a sense of who's out there and how many people are growing. The USDA does do a mushroom census as part of its ag census, but mostly that's geared towards indoor production, which is really centered in southeastern Pennsylvania. And they estimate that only 2 to 3% of growers are doing logs. So logs really are a small part of the mushroom industry as a whole, and we're sort of yet to know, as a whole region, how many growers are out there. But just to give you a sense, what they found, about 60 growers. All of these growers were currently commercially selling, so that's a distinction there. They had about 18,000 logs themselves in production, and they're averaging close to $5,600 of income grower. Most of these growers are really looking to, as much as sort of, in total is going to triple production, so we're going to get closer to 60,000 logs in production according to this data set. And interestingly enough, one of the questions they asked was looking at supply and demand, and a vast majority reported that in their market there's a much higher demand than the supply can currently meet. So there's room for more, and I think that's a really positive aspect of this type of system. So the reason, if we look at sort of zoom out and look at big picture, why Shiitake is working for us, there's a lot of pieces to this, and we're going to talk a little more in detail about sort of economic viability. And to me, viability is not just your balance sheet and looking at sort of how much do I spend to establish my production system and how much do I make, but also these other factors like what's the market demand, what are people willing to pay, and some of the forces around land taxes, things like this that we're going to get into that really at the end of the day are what determines if something's viable. And to me, viability is only going to be indicated by how many people actually adopt this practice. So I can tell you in 5 years what that looks like. If we can determine that this is a viable crop, but it has extremely good potential for that. What we see now is, again, you get reliable production throughout the growing season. People are even getting into season extension, so beyond that June to October window, there's opportunities to expand and sort of extend that season. The demand remains high, and we're commanding a very high price for these mushrooms. Folks are valuing long-run mushrooms and really high-quality mushrooms over what has been the industry standard, which for Shiitake has been pretty low quality. We had an indoor grower in the last class that pointed out that indoor cultivation can certainly produce high-quality mushrooms, which is absolutely true. That's a bit more of a science, and I'd say if you get into log-grown cultivation, one of the nice things is that the natural conditions of the forest really help you create very high-quality mushrooms, which is a nice piece to it. Cultivation research has been really key. University of Missouri has done some initial research, mostly back in the 90s, and then I mentioned Cornell having done a lot. One example is that when Shiitake came to the States, it wasn't actually legally allowed to be grown until 1981. The USDA determined that it wasn't a species that had any sort of threat, and it was allowed into the States. It was assumed because Shiitake, roughly translated from Japanese, means mushroom of oak, that oak trees were the only species that it would grow on. And we've since found, Cornell research in particular has found that oaks, all the oaks, sugar maple in particular out of the maples, and American beech all perform pretty much the same, which obviously has some implications for forest health and for some of the opportunities for landowners, because you may not have access to oak, but a good chance that you have access to maple or some of these other species. We've since found growers and folks also successfully cultivating on species like hop hornbeam, ironwood, birch, chestnut, all sorts of different things. In addition to just knowing how to grow, we've done a lot of work on industry development, and what this looks like is really a lot of different little grower networks. There's some statewide networks, there's regional networks, and I'll talk a bit about our listserv and ways you can stay in touch and get involved. And our Small Farms program has continued to do some of the grower outreach and continues to educate people about the potential, as well as sort of put out fires and respond to grower requests for help. And I'll talk about a few of those interesting things that we didn't expect as we got into this we would have to encounter. And I think that the biggest exciting thing for me is when I look at the big picture, one of the discoveries we made was that there's a real nice tie-in from log cultivation to forest health. And particularly, it's in utilizing low-grade timber and providing really an economic incentive for timber stand improvement. And this is often, we have a lot of forests that are sort of in this middle stage, and they may have recently had a timber harvest or even a more destructive harvest like a high grade, or they may have recently been abandoned farmland. And these young forests have a lot of small diameter wood that's really prime for mushroom production, but isn't necessarily ready for a lot of other uses. And by thinning out some of those stands, we can increase the health of the forest, we can take out disease and pest pressure potentially, and we can grow better timber. So while we'd all love to be taking all of our time out there doing those kind of intermediate thinnings, it's hard to do that without the economic incentive. And I think mushrooms are at least one of the ways that we can put some dollars into our work that happens in the woods. Another interesting aspect is that mushrooms are not only a valuable food product, but they're also a really important medicinal product. And so we're seeing that as a new angle to production that I think is really starting to take off. So let's look at some of the aspects of the relationship of shiitakes and forest management in a little more detail. A lot of folks attending may be aware of this as forest owners or extension folks or just interested in the topic, that most of the Northeast, and we could extend this pretty far south and west into the Midwest as well, is in a forested state of land use. And while this isn't the sort of original forest, most of this is growth after the abandonment of farmland. We have quite a bit of forest resource at our fingertips. And in New York, we're above 60% forested. And so there's just a lot of opportunity for these kind of interventions and a lot of land to work with. And what we see from small farms is lots of farmers interested in, they've bought a piece of land, they want to know how they can best take care of it. Often that land includes a woodlot. And so rather than clearing the forest once again for agriculture, they're curious about other opportunities to make good use of that forest resource. So if we drill down a little bit deeper in New York, and I suspect that we'd find some similar statistics in other states in the Northeast especially, when we look at the 7 million acres of total farmland in New York, 20% of that designated farmland is actually in woodlot. And we like to joke sometimes that the woodlot's often this kind of often forgotten piece of land in the background of a farmer's mind, and they might go out there and harvest a timber as an opportunity when they are looking to buy a new tractor or put up new fencing or something like that, sort of like cashing in on the savings account. They might go out there every year or so and gather some firewood, but by and large the forest is often seen as a non-productive space. And I actually hear this in a lot of farmer language all the time. It's something I'm particularly sensitive to, and I see happening again and again, and try to discourage some more creative thinking. And so we have a lot of opportunity just from the farmland that's already in production to think about forestry as part of the farm. And a lot of these forests, as I mentioned, are these small diameter stands and are ripe for this timber stand improvement, where we go in and we look for disease or defective or structurally deficient trees. We can make some analyses and look at, we might have two sugar maples growing right next to each other, and one may be 12 inches in diameter at breast height, the other may be 4 inches in diameter at breast height, and chances are those trees have actually probably started growing around the same time. They're probably about the same age. One of those trees is simply expressing more genetic potential for rapid growth. And so we can make those decisions and thin out those smaller diameter trees that aren't going to succeed long-term into the canopy. And those become great mushroom logs. So there's really great opportunities to find the two. And really to grow a good timber crop while we're growing a good mushroom crop. It's really been a change in perspective for me, having worked in the woods for a good chunk of my life, to start to cut down these trees, and firewood is sort of now a last resort for me. I say, well, what else can I do with this wood? Because we'll always have firewood. There's always plenty of wood to devote to that, but are there other potentials? And when I cut down a small sugar maple like this and start cutting into 3-inch logs, then I know that each of those logs is now worth $2 or $3 if I just sold it raw to someone who wanted to grow mushrooms, or maybe even $20 if I were to grow mushrooms on it. It starts to really change the way I see and value what is often called low-value timber. It actually could be, it may not be valuable as timber, but it's certainly valuable as small diameter wood. And so what I like to promote and think about is that we don't want to go into the woods and shop for all the best logs and just pull out all the small diameter wood. And a lot of old mushroom growing guides will suggest that you need to go into your forest and find the straightest, the most perfect specimens for your mushroom logs. And it really turns out the mushrooms don't care. Their job in the forest ecosystem is to break down and decompose the trees that aren't actually that strong and healthy, because those trees will eventually die out anyway as the forest thins itself naturally. And so if we go shopping for mushroom logs, that's one way we could do it. The other way is to work with a forester, develop a management plan, and then do the thinning that we need to do, and then the surplus of that work is really the mushroom logs. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, where we start with forest management and forest health as our bottom line, and we're going to get, I guarantee, plenty of logs out of it. I work with a number of foresters and technical service providers for the NRCS, and there's no shortage of logs. That's not the issue right now. And so we can really make good decisions for the forest as we're doing this. And just interestingly enough, mushrooms can also start to provide some insight or some ideas for potentially other ways to manage forests and other ways to look at rotations. So we're kind of in a timber rotation, so we think about doing thinnings and waiting for timber to mature. But in a lot of other parts of the world, there's other short rotation types of forestry that I don't see very commonplace in North America, but certainly could have good application. So this is in England. This is with chestnut, but also logs that are grown for shiitake mushrooms in Japan and Asia are grown in this manner. This is a type of forestry called coppice agroforestry. And coppice is a simple biological technology where if you cut a tree down to its base or potentially just above browse height, if you have grazing animals or maybe deer pressure, that tree, that one stump, if given sufficient light, will resprout and regrow. And chances are you've seen this, maybe a tree you cut down, or in a city block, if someone cuts the stump off, and it'll resprout and regrow. Well, that can be intentionally managed for poles, and you can really literally grow the wood to the diameter that you want. And this is really the way that shiitakes have been cultivated for a long time in Asia. So if we look at the stand of trees here, what's often done are quarter to half clear cuts, where all these poles are harvested at the same time, and then that stand is allowed to regrow. And then the growers will move on to the next stand, maybe just next to the one they cut a few years ago, and they have this nice mosaic of management. And generally for oak, we're talking 20 to 30-year rotations. So this is often something that people are inheriting from a previous generation or multiple generations of management. But it sets up a really nice system, and in the intermediary of the thinning, you have these nice gaps in the forest, then you have kind of mid-succession habitat, and then you have this full kind of polewood habitat, and you're kind of shifting that management around the woods as you go. So a very sustainable source of wood production, a very interesting type of small rotation forestry. And I should mention a little interesting minute point is that when you do this type of forestry, it actually makes better logs for mushroom production. So logs grown in this way that grow a little bit faster and grow in open light conditions have a much higher, generally speaking, a sapwood to heartwood ratio versus trees from that photo we looked at where they're kind of crammed in and they're in very dense conditions and sort of shady conditions. Those trees often slow down and have much more heartwood. And in the end, the mushrooms really like to consume sapwood. So we don't have any research to back this up, but the more sapwood, likely the more productive your log is. Certainly, what we see is that with coppice agroforestry, a lot of mushroom growers use much smaller diameter wood because most of that wood is more productive. And so, if anything else, it becomes a much easier burden on the back. So that's sort of some interesting pieces about forest management. Let's look a little more in detail about farm profitability. And so I mentioned consistent production being a nice keystone of shiitake and why this really is working. But I want to give some numbers to that. So I've mentioned that each log, when soaked, will produce an average of 1/4 to 1/2 pound of mushrooms for each flush. But if we time that out, and again, I mentioned you kind of flush in different groups and then they need to rest, you can actually flush that log up to 2 or 3 times a year. Okay, so you're moving these logs through rotation, you're soaking them, you're harvesting, you're resting, you're soaking again. And what we found through research is that the average log lifespan is about 8 flushes. Generally, that works out to be 3 or 4 years in production. And so we can really put some numbers to this and get a sense. And so I can say, well, if I'm going to soak 100 logs a week, I should get somewhere between 25 and 50 pounds. Well, I can start to really think about my markets and guarantee to some of those outlets, whether it be chefs or restaurants or farmers markets, that I'm going to have X amount of pounds. And it's very nice as a farmer, from my perspective, to be able to go to a restaurant and say, yeah, I will give you 5 pounds a week from June 1st to October and maybe beyond that. And we're in a food system where the purveyors of food are used to having consistency. So this is a very important aspect to economic viability. I mentioned market demand being really important. It's interesting that we're seeing the price really holding. Generally, $12 to $16 a pound is the retail price for shiitake. And you can see this is a shot from our local grocery store where we're seeing about $6 a pound for the sort of indoor, more conventionally grown shiitake. And certainly you can see the color visually is, I would argue, much more pleasing on the left there, the log-grown mushrooms. Another interesting distinction between these two categories, not just that they look and taste often more robust, is that we have to think about the energy input. So what's nice about log-grown production in the woods is that after the initial inoculation, there's basically zero energy going into this production system. We're using the natural environment of the forest to fruit these mushrooms. The mushrooms grown on the right are in a climate-controlled environment indoors and grown year-round. And so there's considerable energy costs when we think about moderating temperature and humidity to grow these mushrooms. So we're hoping this price continues to stay up, and we're encouraging growers to keep the price around $12 a pound at minimum, although we're seeing even in markets like New York City sometimes $20 a pound for these mushrooms. And this isn't uncommon. In the States, we're catching up a bit with other parts of the world. In Japan, they'll actually analyze and look at the different patterns and the different quality, and they'll pay sometimes up to $80 a pound for really choice quality mushrooms. And so well, that's a common practice in other parts. Generally in the States, we don't distinguish quality as something that we're willing to pay for. But in the case of shiitake so far, we're getting good results. So some of our research, we did some on-farm research with growers, and they were gracious enough to keep really good records of their time and expenses, which is not something farmers often do. And so we really got a good sense we worked with about 25 growers. 15 of those had complete financial data that we could analyze. And out of those 15, 10 of them actually made a profit in just their second year of production, which is a really good turnaround. A lot of other farm enterprises have much higher capital costs, and generally you're thinking of 4 to 5 years of sort of establishment to when you might start to see profit. You can see here that it was interesting the high range of profitability. Some folks were getting about $1.39 a log, and some were getting close to $12 in profit per log. And that really has to do with grower choices, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The disparity there, there's a big difference if I'm making a dollar, on profit versus $12. So that's really up to the farmer, and it's really up to the unique context and some of the thinking that goes into not just how do I grow these, but how do I sell these. So what we found when we kind of did all the math from all these growers is that average profit became, when we kind of negated the highs and the lows, about $5 per log per season, or $15 to $20 over that productive 3 or 4 year lifetime. So the easy elevator pitch is that it costs about $5 to actually get a mushroom log established and growing, and that cost includes your labor to harvest it, inoculate it, manage it, soak it, all those things. So that's $5 a log of input, and you get about $15 or $20 out of it. Okay, so that's quite a good ratio in terms of return on investment. So we started to look at, and we're starting to think about what is a viable enterprise? What is the scale that one needs to get to actually be profitable? And of course, yes, I can grow one log and I could make $20, but at the end of the day, that's not going to do much for me. So there's obviously a scale that's going to be really important. And one of the things we look at a lot in New York is helping beginning and new farmers especially reach for that $10,000 magic number, which in New York is the minimum number of dollars you need to produce of agricultural products to qualify for agricultural exemption, which we'll drill down into a little bit. And in other states, I believe it's similar as well, the rate of when you're considered really farming, and you get to you start to get some of the benefits and breaks. You're eligible for different programs, things like that. So when we look at the math, again, it works out to about a little less than $5 a log. It's about $4,740 to establish and manage a 1,000-log operation. Okay, and again, this is something that's happening over several years. We don't see most people saying, I'm going from 0 to 1,000 in one season. They're usually doing maybe 300 logs a year until they get to that $1,000 mark. And then if you think about it, by the time you're entering your 4th season, some of those logs you inoculated the first year are on their way to retirement. They're not going to be productive. So essentially what happens is you inoculate 300 logs every year perpetually, and it's usually done in the early spring. So when we just take this one snapshot in time, it's not a full accurate because the actual timing of all this is a little more complicated. But to get up to that 1,000 logs, we're talking about a little under $5,000 of cost. And when those logs are fully in production, we should expect about 1,000 pounds of mushrooms per year. And if we sell those at our average price of $12 a pound, we're getting well over the $10,000 mark in income, and that's per year, okay? And so you can once you get the train going, so to speak, then you can really keep this going, and we can then qualify our farmers for ag exemption. So we think about our audiences, and I've mentioned already existing farmers or farmland. Often those folks are already qualified for ag exemption, but they might be looking for supplemental income. But we also have a rapidly growing audience of new and beginning farmers who just bought a piece of land, are overwhelmed with the prospect of farming, all the complicated things they need to learn, all the regulatory issues, all the legal stuff. And then they want to figure out what crops they're going to grow and why should I grow this over this. It's a very overwhelming time, and it's why we put so much energy into it at the Small Farms Program. And those folks are really trying to become viable. And it's really nice to see the opportunity for those folks to make a profitable crop happen and also get them into that tax bracket, because it really helps reduce their costs on an annual basis. But we've also identified a second audience, which is what is called the working woodlot owners audience. And Peter helped turn me on to the National Woodland Owners Survey, which took a wide look at forest use and then kind of broke forest owners into different categories. And so some forest owners own forests and don't hardly do anything, right? But this working woodlot group is in some way managing or taking care of their property. And what was interesting when I started to look and drill down in New York, considerable amount of acreage. There's about 56,000 of these owners working their woods in New York and managing well over 2 million acres. Their number one issue was land taxes, and I've heard this at several things. They say, I have this woodlot, I love it. Man, it is expensive to keep up. I really have a hard time figuring it out. So we're excited about this, and maybe we can pull some woodlot owners into the mix too as growers. They may not have ever thought of themselves as farmers, but a 1,000-log operation is not an inachievable management. It's something that someone could do if they set it up well, maybe with a little bit of help, but they could certainly do it as a part-time kind of thing. And one of the keys to this, though, and designating this as a crop, was we actually had to get this on the in the legislature in New York State to become law, okay? Because if a crop isn't designated as an agricultural commodity, it does not qualify for agricultural exemption. So prior to just this past September, so very recent, woodland products were, if you imagine that $10,000 mark, basically timber, firewood, other woodland products, you could count for up to $2,000 of that $10,000 mark. So the idea was that other $8,000 has to come from other farm products. Now, the only exception in a woodland setting would be maple syrup. So you can produce $10,000 of maple syrup. If you get to that mark, you can count that as your agricultural exemption. And we do have a lot of people doing that. So now, with this new law and having mushrooms included, we can say also that mushrooms can actually be counted entirely for that $10,000 mark. So that means that someone that may not want to do anything but work their woods can now have another crop. And maple syrup is something we do and love to do, but it is a sort of expensive thing to get into. It takes some time to build up the capital to get into sugaring at that scale. So shiitake, I think, has the advantage in terms of being sort of low input in terms of being able to get started. And certainly we see our farm being diversified, and And frankly, the maple syrup and the mushrooms go really well together, not just culinary in a culinary way, but also in terms of the seasonal timing. And we're managing just 1 acre of trees, and we have our mushrooms in there, and we do our maple syrup, and it's a really nice synergy. But what's nice about that is if you were to qualify for this agricultural exemption, let's say your land is worth $2,000 an acre, well, now it can actually be eligible for the woodland rate, which is $384 an acre. So you'll only be taxed based on that amount. So it's a considerable savings. And there's lots of different products that we can pull out of this to actually offer for production. And I want to get into some of these because it's not just the mushrooms, but other things that folks could be thinking about. So one thing we've talked about is selling fresh mushrooms. Of course, the wholesale price generally $10 to $12, retail $12 to $16. That's pretty common. What's nice about mushrooms is that if you have any ones that don't look nice and perfect and may not be desirable to your buyers, value-added products become a really achievable thing as well. So there's really no reason to have any waste. You can actually dehydrate mushrooms very easily. You can grind them into a powder. We've seen people selling those kind of things, making spreads or pâtés out of mushrooms. There's lots of things that we can do. And I mentioned, too, that medicine is another thing that folks have started to focus on. So we see growers actually specializing in extracts or tinctures of medicinal mushrooms, and that being part of their farm enterprise. And that can, the markup on those, so to speak, is considerable. So you can actually sell relatively little amount of medicine compared to fresh mushrooms and make a decent amount of money with that. But in addition to that, I want to mention a few other uses because there may be some folks out there who just aren't interested in really getting into the mushroom business, but do have woodlots and want to do some management. So one option is to actually you could just sell inoculated bulbs. Maybe you're thinking a hobby aspect for yourself. You say, hey, I want 20 logs for myself, but I have the time to inoculate 100, so why not, I'll save 20 for myself and I'll sell 80 of them. And what we've seen, again, is that it costs about $5 a log, and that includes your labor, all right? And you can sell those for up to $15 to $20 a piece, okay? If you were going to sell them in bulk, like 100 logs at a time, it wouldn't be that much. It might be more like $10, but individually you can sell them pretty easily for $15 or $20. And I've done this several times for the farm. We often sell maybe 20 or 30 logs a year. Nice little side income. We go to a holiday farmers market, and we actually bring not 3-foot logs, but half-size logs, and we sell them as gifts for the holidays. And you wouldn't believe how many people love the idea of giving their loved one an inoculated mushroom log. And we sell those little half logs for $10. So a full log is about $20, and people love them. And it's a really nice gift. They get to experience it, they get to take it home, and it's been quite successful. But you can also just sell the wood to growers potentially for inoculation. And this is the newest of enterprises, and I think it's a really good fit, especially for folks that are already thinking and doing firewood management and selling firewood. And we worked a little bit with the Shiitake Growers Association in Wisconsin, who is a little bit ahead of us in developing this. So one of the things in Wisconsin is that the top half of the state is very forested. The bottom half is very agricultural and doesn't have a lot of woodlots. So they're trying to connect woodlot owners in the north part of the state with growers in the south. And so they've figured out that a cord of wood, about the equivalent volume, is about 150 of those 3-foot logs. And so you can sell those in different ways. If I'm a grower and I go to a site and someone has done a timber sale, I might pay 50 cents a log to harvest that wood. If I go and pick up logs that a woodlot owner has harvested and put up by the side of the road, I might pay $1 a log, and I'm going to drive those home. And if they're delivered to me, we've seen a good range from $2 to $3 per log delivered. And so if you're willing to do delivery, you could decently make $300 to $450 a cord for this work. Now, it's not all an easy game because there's some particular things you need to pay attention to. It's not turnkey, and there's some unique needs of growers if you're going to get into this type of production. Here's just an example. I had a logger. I bought logs from him a couple of years ago, and he dropped them off in 6-foot lengths, but it was nice. He marked them, you can see, in half, so I could easily buck them up with a chainsaw, and it's just because the 6-foot lengths fit the best on his trailer. And so I paid $250 for these delivered, And honestly, when I did the math, for my own time in the woods, this was equal or cheaper to just buy the logs than to spend all my time in the woods. And I love running a chainsaw. I like spending time in the woods. But at the end of the day, if I don't have the time, and maybe I'm more capital intensive or sort of wealthy at a certain point, or I don't have the time, it's actually pretty economical if I value my time at $10 or $12 an hour to pay someone else to do that work. And it works well for someone who's already doing firewood because you can see the price is pretty good. Now that price and sort of the quality is, again, firewood is somewhat easy because you can really just beat it up. It doesn't matter the quality. But with mushroom logs, you really have to focus in on some particular details. So wood species is going to limit what you can do, of course. So you might have to be a little more selective and a little more sorting through your wood species. There's less species that are good for shiitake cultivation versus firewood. It's really important the timing of the cut, so we don't want these logs to be sitting around for more than a couple months. We generally want them to be harvested and delivered as soon as possible. And what we want to see is mostly having these logs harvested in January and February and delivered in March or April for growers to use. You have to think about log diameter and length. It's really important to have consistency in that. That's similar to firewood in most cases. And the big one, though, is the level of scarring or bark damage. For shiitake production, you really need intact bark that's supposed to keep, as I mentioned before, keep moisture in and keep contamination out. And so if you're used to skidding logs out, dragging them behind some machine out of your woods, that's great for timber, it's great for firewood, but it's not so good for mushroom logs unless potentially you have a lot of snowpack or something like that. And I've had to reject a lot of logs from folks that I bought them from because I've been very explicit up front that if it has bark damage, I'm not going to pay for it. And so it really takes a working relationship with someone who's harvesting to get the types of woods that you want. Another thing is I've had deliveries before where the trees are all kind of crooked and bent up, and if you have too many of those, it really makes it hard to move them and stack them. So I tend to be a little particular about how straight those logs are as well. And as the firewood dealers get to know me and get to know what I want, they're able to do it a little bit better. But it's not necessarily easy. If anyone's interested, SHIGA is the Shiitake Growers Association of Wisconsin, which is doing some of this wood source connection, which I think is a great development of this industry. And one of the interesting things we talked about in the webinar this afternoon that Peter brought up is that there's a good potential that if you are a woodlot owner and you partnered with a mushroom farmer, and you signed a 5-year agreement, this is in New York State again, and you signed an agreement that said, I'm going to provide you with mushroom logs for the next 5 years, and I'm going to cut those logs, deliver them at this price, et cetera, your woods could actually qualify for ag exemption as well. And it's similar to if you have property that another farmer has, as long as that farmer qualifies for ag exemption, he or she can count any land that they lease or any land they use as part of that exemption. So that's an interesting potential. We will stay tuned as it unfolds and we see individual tax assessors sort of make their distinctions. And a question alongside of all this idea about transportation of wood is how does this relate to firewood hauling restrictions? And again, this is in New York State. We've gotten sort of confirmation from the DEC that there's an exemption. Firewood is very specific to the intended use of the material, so even if it looks like firewood but it's intended for another use, as long as it's clean, there's no evidence of any insects or infestations, it's legal to transport it around the state. So mushroom logs would not be considered under the sort of 50-mile quarantine that we have in New York State. Now the exception of that is if you're in a quarantine zone for, let's say, Asian longhorn beetle or something, you wouldn't be allowed to move maple, let's say, out of that quarantine zone. For emerald ash borer, we don't really grow any mushrooms on ash, so we're not really don't need to be concerned about that one in particular, which is nice. And so let's finally drill down just a little bit about improving efficiency. So one of the things that we see in viability is not just does the crop work, but how diverse are the income streams. So you can see here we have lots of income stream potential from someone who is interested in working in a woodlot. There's also little nuances as you're cultivating that can really help improve your chances of success. And I just want to acknowledge the folks from 3 different universities that put together a lot of this work. A lot of these things came out of that data collection we did with farmers over 3 seasons. We really got to understand what are the real time sucks, what are the expenses that really can drag someone down, and what are the choices people can make to really make this a viable thing. So you can see here we had quite a range of locales for this grant. We worked with about 25 growers to collect this data. And we really learned a lot because each farm is just such a unique organism, and working with individual growers was great to see how this really applies. And again, viability is going to really show itself over the next few years because it has to play itself out in kind of each unique farm situation. But one of the things when we look at the data wholesale is that we found the overwhelming amount of time is spent inoculating logs. If you consider inoculating logs and felling trees as all the work you have to do before you even start harvesting or selling or soaking or doing any of the parts of production, that's 50% of your time is just cutting the trees down and inoculating the logs. So to me, that would indicate that thinking about efficiently inoculating logs is going to be really key. Thinking about doing this stuff in the off-season is going to be really key because the management, soaking, all those other pieces are often during the busy farm growing season. And that's one of the nice things about shiitake is you can get 50% of the work sort of out of the way in March or April before the real season starts, which is a nice benefit. And one of the interesting things that we found is that while, of course, the owner does the majority of the work, and there's very little employment right now in mushroom cultivation, there's a considerable amount of work from volunteers and friends. And this actually relates very directly to inoculation. Inoculation by yourself, if you do 350 logs with yourself or your spouse together, is drudgery. If you do it as a work group and you invite some friends over and you make them some soup or bring them some beverages, play some music, make it a really fun atmosphere, and you say, hey, if you help me out for a few hours, I'll let you take a few logs home. Most of our growers have good success getting folks to come out. They love the experience, they love learning about it, and they get to take something home with them. And that's really how, it's really the Tom Sawyer approach to how people get this work done. It can be a lot of fun as well. When we look at some of the expenses, we can see that a lot of the things that farmers are spending money on are what are called durable goods. They're things that are only a one-time expense. And so one of the key things to startup and to efficiency is to really not try to get too much into some of those durable goods. So avoiding buying a new chainsaw, nice new ATV, all these things you say, oh, I really need this. And we call this, in the small farm program, we call this shiny equipment disorder, where new farmers just love to look through catalogs and say, I really just need this tractor and I have to get it. We've seen a lot of farmers struggle because they have those huge upfront capital expenses that then they're trying to pay down for many years. So if you can scrape by, that's going to be much more, it's going to give you much more success in terms of your bottom line, especially in those first few years. And again, this is a place where someone might be able to save money if they say, well, it's not worth me buying a chainsaw, taking safety courses, getting an ATV or a tractor. Maybe I should just buy the logs, right, at the end of the day. So this is the graph showing those durable versus non-durable goods. So that $5 per log expense actually should go down after some of these initial investments. So it may be more like $2 or $3 a season. So that's sort of our last ending slides here. Just some ways to save time with efficiency. Purchasing bolts instead of doing them yourself. I mentioned that several times. Having a very efficient setup for inoculation can be really key. I've seen some very awkward and painful ways people inoculate logs. So thinking of it like a conveyor belt or sort of a stream of production can be really important. I've encouraged growers to design the system, and especially your lane yard, to think about how you're going to move logs around, where you're going to soak them, and make that a very efficient process. That can save a ton of time, especially during that growing season. And again, stacking your labor pre the busy season can be a really effective use of time. So you can really start inoculating bolts kind of any time as spring is kind of starting to emerge. And again, avoid purchasing lots of that equipment unless it's really necessary. So I'll just mention a few things, sort of resources as we wrap up here, some pieces we've been working on. We will be posting these soon. We have some enterprise budgets that we'll be putting on cornellmushrooms.org. It's a way that you can plug in different numbers, look at how many logs you might produce, and get some of the numbers about the economics of it. All right. We have a listserv. So if you go to cornellmushrooms.org and you click on Network, you'll find the instructions on joining this listserv. And it's about 250 members of different capacities. And what's great about it is you can really just ask any question, and you're going to get 3 or 4 different opinions in response. And we found this a great way for people to just communicate and learn from each other. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in staying in touch, to join that listserv. That's really the bread and butter of our network at this point. We worked this year with Farm Bureau again and Nationwide Insurance, because one of the emerging issues that we were really surprised to find out was that growers were getting their insurance dropped, or they're getting denied from new policies because they said they were going to grow mushrooms. And we learned that this was really it was just a miseducation of insurance companies not really knowing what this was, and being generally very afraid of potential contamination, poisoning, all these different things. Once we had some nationwide insurance agents out to tour different mushroom farms, they realized it was no more risk than a vegetable operation or anything, and so we were able to at least have one carrier that's willing to work with growers, which is an important development that can stall some people. We're working on solar dehydration, so when you dry mushrooms in the sun, you can actually increase the vitamin D content of those mushrooms, and so a lot of conventional regulatory mandates require that you dry things inside in a commercial food dehydrator, but if you actually expose them to sun, you increase their nutritional quality. So we're trying to figure out safe and sanitary ways to do that. And last thing is we're working with Certified Naturally Grown, and we're also working on some online training modules to support verification. This is ways to do quality control, to talk about safe and sanitary production, and specifically if people want to be sort of organic certified, Certified Naturally Grown is just another label that has a set of standards that if you follow, you get the label. So we've been working with them to specifically work on some standards for production, and I think that'll help clarify some of the details of this type of agriculture. So that's the end of the talk for me. I'll just mention there's a few opportunities to learn coming up. We have our online mushroom cultivation course, which is a 6-week class starting in February. We do an annual Camp Mushroom, which is a hands-on training on Cornell's campus in Ithaca, usually in April. So we'll have a date will be announced. If you join the listserv, I guarantee you'll hear about it. And I'll also be doing a presentation and a demo of inoculation at the Verona Maple Conference, which is coming up in New York. That's up by Utica on January 9th. So with that, I will take any questions folks may have.
Steve, that was another great presentation. Thank you. So, folks, this is the time. If you have questions that you've been holding back on, please feel free to start typing them into the chat window. While you're getting those written up, I have a couple for Steve that I didn't get answered during the noon hour, so I'll jump with those. You talked about bark scuffing on mushroom bolts, and that those were essentially a defect. How about branches? So if you're working with a bolt and you have, you know, you can prune some branches off that bolt. Is the wound caused by the pruned branch? You know, so you fell the tree and you cut the limbs off. How many limbs are tolerable on a mushroom bolt?
I think
is there a way to gauge that?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually a problem as long as you know, the limb isn't like ripped off so that the bark's essentially scarred. So if you know, like you would prune any tree, you get kind of a pretty small opening. I think that's usually perfectly fine.
So you can have, if you could have a, you know, the bump of the branch, you just want to minimize the amount of exposed wood. Yeah,
I would say, and even like nectaria canker, like common. You know, different fungal diseases, often those colonize the bark, and you can still inoculate those logs because they don't tend to get into the sapwood. So we've seen even, for instance, like beech bark disease with lion's mane and also with shiitake. As long as the bark is relatively intact, the sapwood actually tends to be unstained, and you can actually grow mushrooms right in there. It's just when the bark is like flaking off, it's kind of too late.
Okay, that was actually my next question about beech bark disease.
Yeah,
so.
There you go.
All right,
well,
great.
You know, because at the Arnott, it's so prevalent.
Right.
We've been growing there for years. So.
Yeah, I didn't know if you had some secret place where you had beech without any beech bark disease. Okay, so John wants to know if you should match inoculum source, maybe source and/or species, to tree species.
Sure, it's a great question. So I'll just mention, if you go to again to cornellmushrooms.org, there's a supplier tab on there as well, and that gives you some of the spawn producers. which are sort of like seed companies for mushrooms. And yeah, within Shiitake there are strains, so different. It's sort of like different cultivars. If you think about apples, you know, there's Liberty and Northern Spy and all this, sort of like that. With Shiitake, there are different ones that will grow better on certain species. But more specifically, it's the type of mushroom needs to match the species. For example, oyster does not grow very well on most of the species that Shiitake grows well on, but it grows great on poplar and cottonwood and tulip poplar. So that's where some of the other species can play a role, is in if you have excessive amount of poplar, then you might want to look at oyster. And really the best way is to consult our resources about that. We generally detail the types of species, but also feel free to call the companies and say, hey, I have box elder. What could I grow on box elder? And often they can suggest something to try if they don't have direct experience with it.
Okay. And then Brett wants to know if they're how common and how, I'm assuming, how to prevent birds pecking out the wax and eating the inoculated spawn.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's, I'd say it's maybe 5 to 10% of growers that I hear from have this problem. And I've heard of a lot of different creative solutions. It's not something I've experienced a lot with birds. One thing I've seen is it's what you want to protect, and mostly what you're concerned about with the wax and sort of that inoculated spawn is during the spawn run itself that year. And so some growers say, well, what I do is I stack my logs in really tight formations, and I cover them with even shade cloth or agricultural fabric, or even one grower went to the point of covering everything with chicken wire and kind of deterring the birds from getting in there. And as long as that log is colonized, it should produce just fine, even if eventually some birds come and eat the mycelium later. But it's a pretty small problem. I think it just has to do with your wildlife populations in the woods. Same with deer. We've had like 1 or 2 instances where people have had problems with deer eating mushrooms, but by and large, that is not something we see as a pest issue.
Okay. So I have 2 more questions. How much, you say you have 1,000 logs, and you visited with, I'm sure, with a lot of producers that have laying yards. How much land area do you need for 1,000 logs and tanks to soak and, you know, kind of general staging area? You're talking about a 1/4 acre, 1/2 acre, 1 acre? What can you get just a feel for the? Yeah, if you had an ideal footprint, what would that be?
Well, I think I mean, our main production area, we have sort of this nice acre of really nice sugar maples, and we take up less than 1/4 of that for our actual laying yard. You could stack it. You could stack things and actually be even. We're kind of giving ourselves some space so we can get the ATV and things in there. You could actually do it in considerably small space, maybe 1/10 of an acre even. And you can really, once these logs, if they're cut uniform in length, you can stack them pretty high. So we use about 1/4 of an acre or so. You know, that's for tanks and stacking logs and having enough space to kind of move them around. But I've seen laying yards in pretty tight quarters before. So it really just depends on how high you want to stack them. Yeah.
Okay. And then how do you keep track of, as you have logs, you know, kind of, you're managing inventory. So how do you keep, if you have 350 logs a year that are going to go someplace else,
yeah.
How do you keep, do you keep them together in batches? Is that the best way to do it, or tag them, or?
You just have to name each one and we've been dealing with this since the beginning, and we used to use these like horticultural metal tags, but we would mark the logs of the year and everything, and those would get beat up. And then we tried flagging, and we tried paint, and all these things would just kind of wear off. And what we end up doing, and one of the interesting things is that you actually don't want to have all of your, you know, first-year logs in one group, and then all your old fourth-year logs in another group, because that'll mess up your production. Cause actually,
I bet, yeah.
The growth is really on a curve, so the first couple soaks are really your most productive, and you actually want to mix up your ages. So what I tend to recommend is people just, you know, number their groups essentially 1 through 7, because there's basically 7 groups if you do the math. You kind of keep all your logs in one group. And so you can kind of keep track of how productive that group is. But then within the group, I mean, you generally start to see the bark falling off and a lot of deterioration. You can kind of start to guess when things are going downhill. But what we've done, we have a 2-strike rule in our mushroom yard. So if we soak a log and it doesn't produce anything, then we actually put a piece of flagging tape around it. And if the next time we soak it, it doesn't do anything, then it's out. So it kind of gets, that's a way we can kind of weed things out. And it's surprising. Sometimes those ones we flag actually do produce the next time. So we give them a shot. And those logs just end up going, they usually line our paths, or we kind of put them off to the side because they will continue to fruit for, here and there as they sort of continue to decompose. So.
All right. Neat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think you've covered all the questions, Steve. I want to thank you again. This is a fabulous presentation. And for those of you, I mean, you all have seen it. This and the noon hour session were recorded, so I'll usually, by default, I always go with the noon hour session. But I will upload that to the Forest Connect channel on YouTube, and you can watch it there. And Steve, if you want a copy, I'll send you an MP4 copy if you'd like that to do whatever with. So. All right. Well, thank you, Steve, and I'd like to thank you all for participating. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you back on the 3rd Wednesday of December. So have a great evening.
All right. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Steve. Great job.
Sure. Peter, if you want to actually, if it's by default, I would actually